Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell of the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Let's get started. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode. Now, today we're going to look into the topic of family functioning. I'm definitely not the qualified person to define this, so we brought on an expert from Arizona. He is a professor in communication at the University of Arizona and the author of 16 publications involving communication, including The Loneliness Cure, which is 6 strategies for finding real connections in your life. Dr. Kory Floyd, thank you so much for joining me, Kory.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, when going into research into this topic today and some of your work as well, there's a lot of focus on close relationships and intimacy. What is it about this area that really inspired you to keep looking into it?
I think primarily the fact that we all have relationships. So we all have something to contribute to the conversation. And of course, we all have challenges when it comes to relationships. So when I study this, I know I can talk to almost anyone about it and it will resonate with them in one way or another.
Now, as family, this is the family show. What have you found to be a family's biggest issue when it comes to keeping close relationships with each other?
Oh, I don't know that I could pinpoint a biggest issue. Anyone who has been part of a family, which is just about all of us, knows that they are, on one hand, wonderful institutions and they do a lot for us. On the other hand, they can be fraught with challenges. And so if I tried to pinpoint any one specific area and say, this is sort of the biggest challenge facing families, it would just be arbitrary in the sense that maybe I would be picking something that I thought was an interesting challenge to me, but anybody listening to this podcast might say, well, that's not what my family struggles with. I think that when you have a relationship that is so heavily interdependent, the way that families are, where everyone in the family depends on everyone else in one way or another, there are multiple potentials for challenge, from conflict to emotional difficulties to just difficulties in understanding one another at a basic informational level. And that's not even considering families who are dealing with things like trauma or mental health issues or incarceration or poverty or other kinds of really dramatic challenges that so many families face.
Mm-hmm. And there's a really great and in-depth list as well. I think there's so much that, like you said, families deal with so many different things and different families deal with different situations. And
they do.
Especially, like, I can only take it from my experience with my family. My biggest issue within my family is the idea of everyone has different communication styles, which make it very difficult to express in a way that the other person is available to listen as well, I think. And that's definitely an issue within my family that we all of us pretty much admit to, is the fact that we never really know what the other person is talking about until one of us blows up, and then we are forced to hear what the other one is talking about. And I think it's a very complicated issue when it comes to communication as well within a family, because the idea of, okay, everyone has different ways of listening. Everyone has different moods. There's sometimes like I don't want to hear what everyone has to say because I'm not in the mood to really want to take it all in and take their advice in. And it builds off that kind of friction between family members that can also be, I think, lead to bigger issues down the line.
Of course, all the challenges that you just named occur outside of families too. These are really communication challenges, and not so much situated in or limited to the family. I think the fact that we notice them in families, maybe more than other kinds of relationships, is just testament to the fact that family interdependence can be so strong. So when we talk about that term interdependence, what we mean is that every person in the family affects and is affected by everyone else. And the way that we affect others and the way that we are affected by them differs, and the extent to which we affect and are affected by others differs. But even though we belong to a family, as you pointed out, each of us brings our own communication style to that relationship. And that is in part grounded in our personalities. And just because we're related doesn't mean our personalities are the same. So we may function differently in the world as a matter of who we are. And it also varies as a function of our experience. So as we communicate with other people, we learn what works for us, what doesn't work for us. And so each of us brings a different viewpoint, a different set of experiences, a different set of expectations to communication in the family. And that can create a situation, as you alluded to, that is sort of ripe for misunderstanding, where family members can have a difficult time communicating and listening and hearing each other until it comes to a point where their lack of communication really becomes problematic. And then, as you say, we realize that we haven't heard each other because we just blow up at each other. And that's when we're forced to listen. So what you're describing is much more the norm than it is the exception in a lot of families. That doesn't mean that family relationships are doomed or that no family can possibly function. Obviously, we find ways of functioning and getting along and working together toward common goals as families, but it is not without its challenges.
Yes, I always will forever say that family is so much about give and take. There's so much about compromising that sort of takes place. And I want to thank you so much for that introduction. Before we get deeper into it and ask the harder hitting questions, I like to start off with a little bit of a get to know you, sort of to get to know some of your interests and maybe some recommendations that you could share with the audience today. Now, to start off with, do you have a favorite book that you could share with us?
I have several favorite books. I'm one of those readers who usually has 4 or 5 different books going at the same time. So my interests vary, and I get sort of sucked into one book, and then I find another one that looks too interesting to wait. So I start reading that one as well. And before I know it, I never know where I am in any of the books. Thank goodness for my electronic book, which keeps my place, so I know when I come back to it. You know, honestly, a book that I found really intriguing and compelling is a book that's been out for a number of years, and it's one that I have come back to a number of times, and that's Malcolm Gladwell's Blink.
Okay.
So this is a book, if you're not familiar with, that talks about how we as human beings are often attuned to making split-second decisions and perceptions, especially about other people. And although conventional wisdom might lead us to believe that a split-second decision about somebody else is never going to be accurate, it's never destined to be correct, what Gladwell does is talk about how actually our ability to perceive other people in what he refers to as thin slices of information can be remarkably accurate. And to me, that just speaks to how we are so built as social beings that our ability to perceive each other socially is pretty fine-tuned. So I just really love that observation. I've gone back to that book a number of times, even though it's one that's been out for quite a number of years now.
Yeah, no, that's such an interesting concept to sort of connect with communication as well, especially like looking into it and sort of will always, when I love talking to people, I love to see in between the lines of what they're saying as well. So like not only do they verbally communicate, but they also, the body language communicates, the understanding of whether their voice is cheerful, whether it's a little bit down. They could say, "Oh, I'm fine," but not really be fine in
But
other
everything
language.
else that they're sort of communicating to you tells you otherwise. Yeah.
Exactly. And I
Yeah.
love to sort of be able to recognize that as well. I think um, well, I like to say that I'm a little bit attuned to understanding that a little bit more and to understanding other people's body language. I'm not great at it, but I can definitely see that there's more to it than what they're saying. I think it's a very interesting way. And when you talk about people as being social beings, I think that's the truest statement you could make, is the fact that we are open to hearing about other people's lives, because otherwise, why would we ask the question of how are you going, or what is it that we're doing? Or like, we're asking those questions that want to involve ourselves a little bit more in other people's lives and get to know another person. And those phrases wouldn't be something put together if we weren't social beings in itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Social psychologists talk about our need to belong, not our desire
Mhm.
or our inclination, but our need. And what that term implies is that relationships are almost as fundamental to our well-being as having food to eat or having water to drink or being able to get good quality sleep. That we don't function well
Mhm.
when these needs aren't met. We are not well. We are not functioning properly in the world when we don't have enough to eat or we don't get enough sleep or we don't have high quality connections to other people. That's how important relationships are to us. And so it really belongs on that list of fundamental human needs. I firmly believe that.
No, I agree with that as well. I don't think I'm definitely the kind of person that could not imagine myself living alone, just for the fact that if I don't see a person, then I don't think about people if I don't see them. So I'm really glad that I currently live with my sister and she's the person that I see and go to the most. Otherwise, I definitely would not be as social as I come. Because if I don't see someone, they kind of go to the back of my mind, and all of my work and uni and all the stuff that I'm going through sort of becomes the top priority. So it's good that I
Yeah.
can remember that social aspect as well, that I tend to forget. And I think she tends to forget as well. So we're glad that we have each other to counter that.
It's not that we all need the same level
Mhm.
of connection to other people. Some are perfectly fine living alone. And maybe if they have one or two other close people in their lives, that is plenty. And then there are folks whose social needs are really quite at the other end of that spectrum, where they need to be just surrounded by and stimulated by social interaction very frequently. So we all have our place
Yeah.
on
No.
that continuum. And I think the important thing is to know what your needs are. I mean, just like we don't all need the same amount of sleep, or we don't all eat the same amount of food, but we all need some, right? We
Yeah.
all need some sleep. We all need some nourishment to function. And so it's knowing ourselves. It's you knowing that when you are alone, when you don't have that connection that you feel like you want with other people, you sort of go through your life differently than you
Yeah.
do when you have your sister, let's say, or when you have your close friends around you.
Yes, no, I can totally agree with that. And I definitely see the connection with that as well. I think it's definitely something that we all need. Now, when it comes to a film, do you have a movie that you've recently watched that you could share with us?
Yes, actually, the last movie that I saw in the theater, which I loved, was American Fiction. And
Okay.
it's a film, sort of a movie about a story within a story,
Mhm.
if you will, about a writer who is kind of parodying the way that many writers and filmmakers portray and overly essentialize the Black American experience in this country. And so he writes a book, kind of a spoof, thinking that, well, nobody's going to want to publish this. It's so over the top. And then publishers are scrambling for it, and he gets celebrated and wins awards for it. And so it's sort of about your expectation getting subverted in that way. And I just thought it was quite a nice commentary.
No, that is good. That is an interesting film to sort of get to view, because you're viewing it as an audience whose main character is writing about a story, and you get to see sort of his experience throughout the research that he does throughout writing it as well.
You do. I mean, you as the audience member are peering into the mind of the creator of a new story. And so it is, like I said, a story within a story. And you don't necessarily, you don't necessarily know where it's going. As with many good stories, it takes twists and turns, but I really love the social commentary on the way that we portray various slices of the experience of living, at least here in the United States.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I love the way the films are sort of starting to do that as well. They're trying to really convey the different social experiences that everyone sort of faces, rather than just saying, okay, here's a $1 million actress, go and pay her, go create a film. And they
Right.
really have a meaning behind it now, which is, I love the way that they're doing it with film.
I do too. And that's certainly not to say that everybody's experience is the same, that there's certainly not one monolithic Black American experience, for instance. But that was, I think, part of what the writer is getting at, is that so often writers and storytellers in the past have really essentialized what that experience is. And it's far more rich and diverse than it is frequently portrayed to be. And that's what he wanted to comment on and sort of make fun of and poke fun at and draw attention to. And then his story ended up really receiving a lot of acclaim, which is exactly the opposite of what he intended. So an interesting and twisting story as it goes.
Yeah, no, it sounds really interesting. I've made note of it because I'm now going to have to go and search it up even further, because that definitely sounds like a really fascinating viewpoint as well. There's something that you don't really see every day. So I've now made a list of a film that I have to go and see, which is great.
I enjoyed it quite a bit. Yeah.
Now, when it comes to podcasts, do you have a podcast that you could possibly share with us?
You'd think I would, since I'm here on your podcast, but I actually have never gotten into podcast listening. I don't drive a lot. I've got a very short commute to work, and I know that often that's a way that people pass the time on a long car ride, is by listening to a podcast. I just have never. I have nothing to offer for this particular question. Podcasting is just something that I never really took with me.
So now, either in your professional or even personal life, do you have a role model or a person that you find yourself looking up to within your work?
Within my work, I am just intrigued and enthralled by the work of a neuropsychologist named John Cassiopo. And he passed away a few years ago. But his work was really groundbreaking and really fundamental, particularly in the area of loneliness, which I've spent a lot of my research in particularly the last 5 to 6 years studying. And he has discovered things about the experience of loneliness in particular, and to some extent, the ways to improve that condition, but helping us understand what that experience is like, that I think are truly groundbreaking. And so I find myself going back to his work constantly for not only what he taught us, but as a model of a way to think about it. I'm quite intrigued by his theory of loneliness and trying to understand how his mind worked and how he saw that as a multi-dimensional problem. So I think professionally, he's certainly been a role model that I continue to look up to.
No, he does sound like a very interesting, fascinating person to really find yourself and connect to a lot of your work with as well and build off from what he's sort of figured out and add on to that as well, which is great.
Yeah, he was.
Now, thank you so much for answering some of those questions when it comes to getting to know you a little bit. And I can definitely see a lot of your work within some of these questions that we've asked as well. I hope that you're really warmed up for asking and answering these hard hitting questions that hopefully we have for
I'm
today.
ready.
Perfect. Now, I know that everyone has a very different view as to what family is and what sort of entails with being a family. With either within your research or even your personal everyday life, do you have a definition for family?
You know, I don't have a specific definition that I can quote.
Okay.
I think you're right in that the meaning of family varies quite a bit. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Mhm.
When I look across research on families, particularly when I look at textbooks that are used in classes about families, I see even in that venue a great diversity in the way that family is defined, often going so far as to define the family as a self-defined unit,
Mhm.
which basically puts the onus on us as individuals to define what family means to us. And once again, I don't think that's problematic. I think that so many of us have in our minds an image of what family is and what family should be. And what really matters, I think, is not the way that a social scientist defines family. I think what matters is the way that we as human beings, as individuals, define it. I'm not sure there's ever really been one universal definition of family. But one thing I hear people talking about more frequently these days is the concept of a chosen family. And I often hear this conversation in communities that have been disenfranchised or feel they've been disenfranchised in society somehow. Minorities, particularly sexual minorities like the LGBTQ community, will often talk about, well, there's the family I grew up with that I didn't get to choose. And often people in that community are experiencing rejection from that family. And then there's my chosen family. These are the people that I have selected.
Mhm.
And it may be friends, it may be neighbors, it may be advocates or people who are supportive of the challenges that that community tends to face. And those are the people who will sort of step up and fill the void left by other family members who have rejected them or who have left their life somehow. And many people would say that, you know, my chosen family is actually much more important to me. They're the ones who are there when I need them. They may not be related by blood. They may not be related by marriage or by law or check any of the sort of traditional boxes that we think comprise a family. And yet they can be every bit as important or even more so. So I think that it's okay that there's not a singular definition of family. We sort of know family when we see it. We know it when we feel it.
Mhm.
And I think that's as it should be.
Yeah, I think I really do love the way society is sort of moving forward with the idea of family. I love the way that, like you said, especially in so many different communities where you don't feel as connected to, yes, you grew up in a household or you grew up in a family, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they fit what you believe in with what your
life morals are. I mean, in any situation, any community, there's always that idea of, okay, some families are a bit more strict than others, some are a little more disjointed than others. And
That's right.
a family if you found a family, I think, that offers you that stability, whether it's within your friends, whether it's in the community itself, there is that family that is needed. And I think the whole idea of family, for me, as sort of how I see it and how I sort of go through it as well, is the idea of a group of people that offer that stability and that comfort. And I think that's all that we need, whether it's chosen family or the family that you grew up with. It's people that have that sense of they know what your needs are and how they can sort of be a part of it to make sure that there is that sense of comfort and sense of um, love and support.
That's right. And they're willing to step up and do it,
Yeah.
which our other family relationships may or may not be.
Yeah.
A lot of people have estrangement in their family where they may not have spoken with a parent or a sibling for many years, sometimes over a conflict or a falling out that they had. And for many people, important family members are just they're not with them anymore. They've passed away.
Mhm.
And so there often can be a void. And I think that what matters is not who steps in to fill it, but that someone does.
Yeah. No, I think that is a better way of putting it. I think sort of not like it doesn't matter who it is, but as long as there is that someone that has that ability to do that. And I think that's the main importance. And it's also a neglected conversation, I think. I think we so focus on who we define as family rather than what do we define as being someone who is worthy of being family.
I sometimes teach a course on family communication. And on the first day of class, my typical activity as an icebreaker is I pass out paper plates to all the students, and then I pass around a big box of crayons. This is a university course, but
Yeah.
I get the students coloring on the first day. So they take a few crayons, they've got their paper plate, and I ask them, draw a picture of your family. So I give them some time to do that. And then I ask, well, who would like to share about their picture, introduce us to the cast of characters who's in your drawing. And that always leads us, and this is by design, into a conversation about how did you make a decision about who to put in your picture and who to leave out. And that gets us, of course, talking about what does family mean to you? What does it mean to us? And I've had a lot of students put in pets as part of their family. I've had students put in their car, their summer home, all sorts of a variety of things that they, that to them symbolize a part of their family. So they've got their car, they've got their dog in the picture, but they don't have their grandma. And so it's not that anything is right or wrong. It's not that there's a right way to do the assignment. That isn't the point. The point is that to do that assignment, you have to make a decision, several decisions actually, about who am I going to include? Who am I going to draw? Or what am I going to draw? And then who am I going to leave out? So how do we do that? And that's always our first day of class conversation.
Yeah, I love the way that sort of goes because you're talking about it and my brain is like, I have my immediate family, my pets, and then I think 3 close friends that I would include on the list.
Who would be in your picture? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
exactly.
everyone has a different answer to that. And I think it's for a lot of people, I think we're coming into that stage in society where everything is okay, either you're part of this, or part of my world, or you're not. There's not like because I'm being respectful, I have to add them out of respect kind of sense, which I think is still a lot in there depending on the culture that you come from. But I think in the Western world, there's a lot of that understanding of, okay, if you're not really going to be there for me, are you worthy of being part of the world that I'm building for myself? Or is there a
Right.
part that like grandparents or uncles and aunts, if they're not there to really support you, like what you define as an aunt and uncle and what family should be, are you someone that I want to include in that list of
That's
people
right.
that I
You
would
may
go
not be
to?
making it onto my paper plate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like it's funny because like when you talk about not including grandparents, there's going to be a lot of people that are saying, well, you kind of have to, they are your family. But at the same time, there's that you could easily outgrow certain members of your family as well. That it's different from when you're younger where you're always like, for me growing up, I was always surrounded by a lot of my extended family members. I was always seeing them for Christmas and things. As I grow up, there's changes in my life. We've all moved to a different country. I'm not seeing them as often. I don't consider them that in that family group, which is, it's sad in a sense. I think a lot of people would sort of say, okay, but they're in your genealogy, but genealogy is not how we describe family anymore. And I think it's a great way of seeing how society has developed, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah. Now leads us into a certain aspect of family, which is family functioning. Now, I know that this is a term that I have tried to explain, I think, and try to describe myself. What would your idea of and the terminology of family functioning would mean?
Well, when I think about family functioning, my mind goes to the understanding or the concept of a family as a system.
Mhm.
And a system, of course, is any collection of components that work interdependently. So as I mentioned before, that means that every part of the system affects and is affected by every other part. And so we can't understand a system just by looking at a part or even a pair of parts, because it's the coordination of those parts that matters. If you think about your car, for example, it's hundreds, maybe thousands of individual components that all work together to make your car go when you want to go somewhere. And you could dismantle your car, you could take it apart completely and have a pile of parts, right, sitting in your driveway. So you'd have all the same parts. Physically, it would be exactly the same thing, but you wouldn't have a car. You'd have a pile of parts. It's only a car when they're all working together properly. And so that's a system functioning. And it is functioning in the service of whatever its goal is or whatever its purpose is. With families, of course, with any social system, there are multiple goals. There are multiple purposes. Some of those are quite basic, like giving children life and giving them food and giving them shelter and clothing and education and healthcare and making sure that people are safe and making sure that people are taken care of. There's sort of a fundamental layer or purpose to the family system. But then there are so many other layers that deal with our intellectual development, our identity development, our social development, our relational development, our place in the world, our place in society, our identification as members of that family. And there you get into things like family storytelling and family secrets and family histories and on and on and on. It's a complex system, but dysfunction means that the system is not working toward its goal. It's not working in the service of its purpose the way that it ought to. So that's where my mind goes when I think about family function or family dysfunction.
And I can't help but sort of think about when you're sort of describing the idea of like the system functioning and sort of in relay, like some ideas of functioning, some systems work when it comes to families is that I give birth to a child and that's it. That's my job done. Or that's they're going to be I'm going to be a role model and that's it. But when you talk about, there's so many different things, aspects that add on to that when you have to plan for, you have to come up with a birth plan, you have to come up with all these other little intricate things in order to actually make sure that the child is developed from right off the get-go. And there's a lot of planning that's involved. Like some people say, oh, I want to have a house by the time I'm this age, or I want to have a family in the house by the time I'm this age. But when you think about it, there's so many different other components. So it's similar when it comes to a family, in the family setting, in the fact that, okay, I'm having to think about what my values are as a family and what I want the family values to be before the family actually starts, so that you can implement them yourself in order to sort of be, in order to have that, all these little kinks measured out before your family sort of comes in.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
But of course, anyone who's been in a family knows that plans can go right out the window
Yeah.
at a moment's notice. And so you have to evolve, right? You've got to be able to roll with the punches in a family. And one of the things that's true about the fact that a family is so multidimensional, that it is trying to serve so many different purposes at once, is that because that's true, there are so many ways that the family system can dysfunction. So family dysfunction can look quite different from family to family. In one family, it might be, for instance, that the children are, like you were alluding to before, sort of left to fend for themselves, and they have to take on too many responsibilities. They become what we might say parentified. So you've got children taking care of other children, let's say, because the parents are neglecting their roles. And that's a form of family dysfunction, or the parents are absent. They're just not around. They're neglectful. So the children have to take care of their own needs. That's a really different kind of dysfunction than, say, if there's violence in the family, if there's abuse, physical abuse or sexual abuse, or even emotional abuse, say between spouses or from parents to children, or between one child and another. And that's a very different kind of dysfunction than if it's sort of a loveless family. There's no display of affection, or the parents themselves have no idea how to ensure the education of their children or take them for healthcare. There's so many different ways that system can go haywire. And that, again, is because of the complexity of the system to begin with. So it's really important when we talk about family dysfunction not to think of that as any one singular kind of state or any one singular event. 25 different families can be experiencing dysfunction in 25 truly unique ways.
Yeah. And that's a very great point to sort of mention, especially when every family, like we've said and probably said throughout the earlier in the show, is the fact that every family is very, very different and has very different experiences. Now, one of the aspects that we're looking into today specifically is about communication. What is the purpose of communication in a family?
Well, just like in any relationship, communication has multiple purposes. So once again, we can sort of think of them in a hierarchy. There's a very fundamental level of communication, which is really just the exchange of information. So I ask my spouse, what time am I supposed to pick you up after work today? And my spouse says 6 p.m. So we've had communication, but really just for the purpose of exchanging information. But communication has a lot of other higher order purposes in a family, a lot of higher order functions. We use it to create and maintain a sense of safety. So I can tell people that I care about them, that I support them, that I'm there for them during trying times. That's not to share information as much as it is to remind them that I've got your back. I'm here for your security. I'm here for your safety. That's really, really important for children.
Yeah.
who, as they go through their development, are seeking what a developmental psychologist would call a secure base. They need to find that place in their world where they know they're safe, they know they're secure, so that they can take risks in life, so that they can go out and explore and create and relate to other people, because they have that secure base to come back to. And that, from a developmental standpoint, is meant to be the family. So communication goes a long way toward creating and maintaining that. And then we use it for other purposes like persuasion or entertainment. Humor, for example, can teach us, it can guide us, it can entertain us. There's a wide range of things that communication does in our family. And once again, because that's so diverse, there's so many opportunities for us to get it right. There's a lot of opportunities for us to get it wrong.
I am always stumbled by the different ways that families, especially in my family, the way that we all sort of communicate. And there gets to a point where not one of us is paying attention, not one of us is listening. And I always love to attach communication with comprehension, because you can communicate and you can hear the other person, but you can't really understand the other person. And in a family, when you're dealing with so many different situations, so many different schedules, it can be a really difficult thing to really have a layout set of, okay, if you need something from me, you have to communicate in a way that is going to work for that person, for the time of the day that that person is sort of dealing with as well. And one of the things that always sort of bugged me, especially sort of dealing with the way that my parents communicate, which is one barely communicates and one communicates too often, is how much of communication is nurture and how much of it is just the nature that we're in.
It's such a fascinating question. So the way that this question is normally answered, the way it's normally studied for communication or for any kind of trait, personality traits, for example, is to do a twin study. So as you know, twins come in two forms, identical and fraternal. And identical twins share pretty much 100% of their genetic material with each other. Fraternal twins share about 50%, the same as regular everyday siblings. And so the idea is that if some characteristic, say an aspect of our communication style, is heritable, meaning that it's passed from parents to children genetically rather than through the environment, then identical twins should be more similar on that trait, more similar with each other than fraternal twins should be. So that's the way that it's typically studied. And when communication research has looked at that very question, it has found that a number of communication traits have a high heritability estimate, which means that a lot of the variation in that trait from person to person we can attribute to genetics rather than to the environment. So things like how affectionate we are, or how composed we are in social situations, even how expressive we are of humor. These are largely inherited genetically. Now, not 100%. No personality trait or behavioral trait, communication trait is 100% nature. It's not like your blood type, for instance, or your eye color that you inherit 100% genetically from your parents. So there's a component of the variation in these things that is also environmental, that it depends on the environment in which you were raised and how your parents raised you and who your friends were and what kind of media influences you had and all of the different ways that your environment shapes who you are. It's never really a question when we're talking about personality or communication of, is it nature or is it nurture? It's always a communication, a question, I should say, of how much is it nature and how much is it nurture? How much of it is genetic? How much of it is environmental? And it's an easy thing to overlook in families because we so often look at children and the way that they behave, and we say, well, clearly they take after their parents because you have a very talkative child here. You've got two very talkative parents. Well, obviously, the child learned to be talkative by having two talkative parents. And that's an obvious explanation for us. But if those are the child's biological parents, it is also equally possible that the child is talkative because the child inherited that trait genetically from the parents who clearly have that trait themselves. That's not as obvious to us. Our minds tend to go to the nurture, to the environment. And so it's easy to miss that in a family, even when the heritability of that trait, the nature part of it, might be quite substantial.
And it's one of the things that always fascinates me is the idea of, because my parents vary in their communication and their expression, I should say also, they have passed on, I think I definitely envelop a lot of my mother's traits of being quite expressive and quite talkative, whereas my sister has developed a lot of my father's traits. But one of the things that also fits in is the culture difference as well, because my dad is from a New Zealand background, so it's already culturally a little bit more quiet, whereas my mom has a Malay background, so it's a little bit already expressive. So does culture really play a part in the different ways people communicate as well?
Enormously.
Okay.
Yeah, enormously. And the way that it plays a part is that on one hand, cultures vary in their values and their traditions, the kinds of things that they encourage in the people who belong to that culture. So a culture may value expression and may teach children from a very young age, express your feelings, express your thoughts. Talking is a good thing. Being around other people is a good thing. Other cultures value things like discretion, or they may value privacy, or they may value solitude. And so those things get emphasized in the cultural traditions and the cultural stories, in the things that get modeled for children in that culture, rather than the value of expression. And so as we grow then within a culture, certain things get modeled for us by our parents, by our teachers, by our role models, by people in the media. And so we see over and over and over again those kinds of displays that are in line with our cultural values. And when we act in accordance with those things, those behaviors get reinforced because the culture values that. And so it encourages it and it rewards it. And so we do more of it over time. Culture is an aspect of the environment, maybe the aspect of the environment when it comes to communication, whose influence is pervasive. And so that filters down then into the ways that families communicate. It may have been in your particular family, and I don't know this, but it may have been that you felt more connected to your mother than you did to your father. And so you took after her and she rewarded you for being like her. And perhaps your sister identified with your father more strongly than with your mother, so she took after him. I don't know that that's true, but that commonly happens in families with multiple children. So even though you have the same biological parents, on one hand, you didn't necessarily inherit the exact same genes, the same proportion of genes, but not necessarily the same ones. So your inheritance may have differed, and also the behaviors that got rewarded for you and got rewarded for your sister may have varied.
So, how would you go about sort of having the most effective communication strategy if everyone sort of has different ways of communicating? What would be the steps that would allow all aspects of all different styles to sort of be not sort of held back in like their way of expressing, but also allow even more the more quieter side to sort of have that availability? I know I made that
Yeah.
question very complicated,
No,
but
it's a good question, and the truth is there is no magic answer to it. It's a really important question
Mhm.
because, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, so many families struggle with communication, and there's so many different ways to struggle with it that I would be quite a famous and rich social scientist if I had a sort of 5-step plan to make communication work
Yeah.
in any particular family. But I'll give you what I can. And when you ask that question, my mind goes to a perspective on family communication called family communication patterns theory.
Okay.
You mentioned much earlier in the podcast about individual communication patterns, that each of us as a person has a certain style of communicating. Some of us are more expressive, some of us are better listeners, on and on and on. And this perspective on families says that just like individuals have their communication styles and patterns, so do families themselves. And each family's communication style or pattern is a function of a couple of different things. One is the way that parents deal with their authority in the family. Do they take a really strict role, sort of a my way or the highway, you're going to do what I say whether you like it or not? Or are they at the other extreme where they're very laissez-faire, do whatever you want, I'll just be over here leading my own life and not really taking my role seriously as a person who needs to provide structure and guidance, or are parents somewhere in the middle on that continuum? That's one dimension that goes into it. And another is how expressive are children in a family encouraged to be? My mother grew up in a family, she's 80 now, she grew up in a family in which children were meant to be seen and not heard.
Mhm.
And so if she spoke out of turn, or if she spoke after not having been spoken to, that kind of behavior was reprimanded. That kind of behavior was not rewarded or reinforced. I grew up in a family in which I was encouraged to speak my mind. I was encouraged to express my feelings and my emotions. And so these two dimensions sort of combine to create different kinds of communication patterns in families. And often it's the case that when we look at the various options, the option that sort of rises to the top and represents a highly functional family is a family that that particular theory calls a consensual family. Now, this is a family in which parents maintain an appropriate level of power and control, maybe right in the middle of that continuum that I was describing. So they're not overly strict, sort of a my way or the highway type of approach, and they're not overly laissez-faire, sort of neglecting their responsibility to maintain power and control over the family, but they're somewhere in the middle. They're doing it appropriately. They're doing it in a way that is in the best interests of the family, and in particular in the best interests of the children. And a consensual family is also a family in which children are encouraged to express their views rather than being reprimanded for that. And a really important component of that, so this is getting to the question of what makes a family functional, or what makes communication functional. With children, it's one thing to encourage them, tell me what you think, tell me what you feel. That's an important first step. And that's an important step that a lot of families miss. Many parents I might say, don't particularly care what their children think or what their children feel. They may not admit that, but they might admit it to themselves. So I don't want to go out of my way to spend time to listen to my kids because, what do they know? They're kids, right?
Yeah.
The important thing is I know what I think and I know what I feel. So they may not encourage the behavior, but I think the more important component of it for parents is, what do you do with the things that your children express? Do your children learn by growing up in your family that it is okay to disagree? And this is a really essential component, getting at sort of the heart of your answer. I think that in a highly functional family, when it comes to communication, disagreement and debate are encouraged rather than suppressed. And that's a really difficult thing to do in a family. We don't necessarily like disagreement. We don't like conflict. It's not comfortable for many of us to make space for, let alone to engage in. And so in many families, in many family dynamics, even if this isn't done overtly, there is absolutely the expectation that the parents create. Once again, they may not create it overtly. You may never hear it as a rule, but there is the expectation that it's really important that we all have the same point of view, that we all have the same opinion. I grew up in a family in which that was true. I was encouraged to express my opinion, but there was always that underlying expectation that, well, you better be expressing the right opinion.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to abide you not towing the party line, not expressing the opinion that we raised you to have, the point of view that we raised you to have. That was not rewarded. That was not reinforced. That was squashed. That was suppressed. That created dissension. It created conflict in the family instead of creating space for conversation, which is what it should do. If my child comes to me with a different religious view or a different political view or a different social view than I have and expresses it to me, as a parent, my inclination might be to tell them, well, here's why you're wrong in that. We don't have that opinion. We don't take that perspective in this family. I'm going to raise you to have my values. So let me tell you, this is why you're wrong. And let me tell you the right value, the right perspective, the right opinion to have. That's the way that a lot of parents raise their children. They want their children to have their values. And I get that. I understand that inclination. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that a better way to respond to divergent points of view is to say something like, well, that's really interesting. Tell me more. Tell me more about what you think. Tell me, how did you arrive at that point of view? Is this something that you heard? Is this something that you've thought through? Did you see this on a TV program? Obviously we have to have this conversation at a level that is appropriate for the developmental level of the child. But it's taking a mindset of curiosity rather than a mindset of correction. I'm going to be curious about your point of view. Tell me more. This is fascinating. Rather than, let me tell you why you're wrong and let me tell you the appropriate way to think. That's a lot harder to do. It's a lot more work. It requires a lot more energy, and it requires being a parent who is confident enough, comfortable enough in your own skin, comfortable enough in your own perspectives that you don't find it threatening when people express alternatives. And that was what my parents, and particularly my mother, did not have. She was not comfortable enough in her own skin
Yeah.
to talk with me about divergent points of view. She found that very threatening. And so whenever I would express an opinion or a perspective that differed from her own, it was quickly brought back around in line, and I could tell immediately that it just made her uncomfortable. She got emotional, she got defensive. Once again, I'm not faulting her for this, because it's really hard work. It's difficult
Yeah.
to engage with differences of opinion. And yet when you do that work as a parent, I realize I'm giving you a really long answer, but it's a really complicated question. When you do that work as a parent, there's an immediate benefit, but there's a much more important long-term benefit, which means that you are teaching your child how to function in a world where not everyone is going to agree with them. And you are implicitly teaching your child that's nothing to fear. That's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're all different people. We have different experiences. We have different points of view. That's all right. It's good to be curious about others. And it doesn't mean that you have to suppress the way you feel. You can be curious and listen to other people's perspectives, and then you can share your own.
Mm-hmm.
And you can talk about it. You can talk about the diversity of the perspective that make up your family, or that make up your workplace, or that make up your neighborhood. That's nothing to fear. I grew up fearing that.
Mm-hmm.
And it taught me, as I progressed from childhood into adolescence into young adulthood, I can't talk about certain things in my family. I can't express certain points of view. Those conversations are not going to be welcome.
Mm-hmm.
So I did not grow up in this kind of family that I'm describing. Many of us didn't, or many of us can point to ways in which we didn't. That's the ideal family type from a family functioning perspective, and it's ideal for a reason, because it's not easy to do.
Yeah.
It requires a lot of work. It requires a lot of confidence in ourselves as parents. But if we can do it, the benefits are manifold.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think when it comes to this topic, and it was definitely not a long answer. I think it was an answer that was definitely necessary in the question, because there's so many different ways that it can be spoken about. And I think when you were referring to a lot of the parenting strategy of, okay, children are seen and not heard, it reminds me of the film Matilda, how the focuses so much on, Matilda is very much focused on reading. She's got her own personality. She's got her own view on certain situations. But when her father sort of calls her out on it, there's that idea of, okay, I'm smart, you're little, I'm big, you're not. Like, there's that whole idea of, okay, I'm the parent, I'm who you're supposed to take after. There's no need for you to build your own personality. You're not your own person. When you become an adult, that's, you can do whatever you want. But there's that idea of, okay, children are pretty much the extension of a lot of parents. And that's a viewpoint that has really been detrimental, I think, in sort of defining what that is, especially in today's society where the research is now getting extensive as to the different patterns that parenting sort of takes after, the different ways that parenting is. And like even in my own family, there was a time in my childhood where that was sort of the parenting strategy for my parents. That was sort of the normal communication, the way that they would do. They would tell us to do something, but they wouldn't say why that was important. When we had to move countries, or move cities more, like there was like, okay, we have to move, we're going to move, you're going to go make new friends. There was no question, there was no answer as to why we had to move, because later on we found out that my dad had another job opportunity, but because that was never explained, there was always that part of, okay, we just have to go wherever they go. There's no question in that. And I think as we got older, my sister and I, we both realized that wasn't enough of an answer. Now we got older, we started forcing the questions. We started forcing why that was why it is, and built our own way of communicating that I don't think my parents were well equipped for in how they were raised as well. Whereas they were raised as children are respectful, they just do whatever their parents say. And now you're dealing with two kids who are not from that generation, are not sort of taking the list that we're meant to be doing as an answer for why we're doing it. And their parenting strategy had to change because of that, because there was no way that, oh, I'm going to empty the dishwasher right now. Why can't I do it in like 5 minutes when I'm done doing the current task that I'm managing? Whether it's I'm playing a game, I'm going to finish in about 5 minutes. Then I can do what you set out to me to do, not drop everything just to be able to serve what my parent was telling me. So there's that whole idea of the change in technique as well that I think is needed, is definitely needing. So when you're sort of talking about that, that was definitely a great answer as to how it's sort of evolved and it's sort of changed. And each generation, I think, has sort of gotten in tuned with the whole idea of, okay, you are your own person. Even as a child, you are definitely your own person who has a whole other way of thinking about things. And I think my mom used to always say that I definitely am a big task for her, because because my grandma always told her, just wait till you have kids. And then this was the karma that she got within that, because it's definitely changed her ways of trying to be a parent.
And of course it would.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that comment many times, just wait until you're whatever that role happens to be.
Yeah.
And there's so much truth in that, because of course, we can never really embody a role until we find ourselves in it. We can imagine what kind of parent we might be, but until we're actually there, we don't really know. Another point I want to sort of follow up on in terms of what you said is that, once again, so many of these observations and these points of advice about family have to be taken within the cultural context in which they are occurring. So there are cultures that strongly value and emphasize and reinforce deference to parental authority, much more so than other cultures do. Mm-hmm. And so we might talk about the importance of, say, explaining your decision-making to a child or allowing your child to disagree with you. And in the Western world, that has a certain resonance because we tend to be fairly individualistic in our cultures. We value the idea of growing into your own person and that you're not just a carbon copy of somebody else. Other cultures don't value that quite so much. And so what's going to work from one culture to another, what's going to make a family more functional or less functional, has to be considered within the cultural context. We can't think of that in a vacuum and say that, well, since it works in the Western world, it obviously would work everywhere else. That's just not the case.
No, it's definitely not the case. It's a very, I think communication and the pattern that sort of takes place is very differing towards culture. And I think we've definitely established that there are variations as to how communication is sort of sent out into the world and how they sort of have, especially parents. I think parents in different cultures are very, very vast in how they choose to sort of parent and be a parent. Now, this leads us really well into the next part of the show, which is the practice and habit. And this is some of your own practices that you do within your family or you have done within your family. What do you recommend as a practice to really enhance the quality of communication within a family?
Well, once again, there's so many different directions I could take a question like this, but I'm an affection researcher. And so I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the expression of affection in families. I've been studying that now for almost 30 years. Why we express affection, how we do that, how that varies from relationship to relationship, and what affection does for us. And like a lot of other communication tasks or communication behaviors, families vary a lot, one from another, in how affectionate they are and in how they show affection, how they show love. Some parents are very demonstrative. My parents were very demonstrative of affection. Some parents just aren't like that at all. And that is partly their personality. It's partly their genetics. It's partly the way that they were raised by their own parents. But I have made that a really important value and practice in my own family. And not just in my nuclear family, not just in the people that I live with, but with my parents, with my siblings, with my extended family. Affection is something that I value so much that I make space to practice that. I make sure that I am communicating that verbally, that I'm communicating it non-verbally, in whatever ways are appropriate, whatever ways are available to me when I'm interacting with people in my family. But that is something that takes high priority in my own family, is making sure that my family members know that I love them.
Mm-hmm. And would you say it's important to find your, so, sort of say, an individual's priority when it comes to how they express love and support? Is it important for each individual to sort of find their way of showing that love and support to another family?
100%, right? There's 35 or 100 different ways to show somebody that you care about them. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've learned, which I mean, I think we probably all know just experientially, is that we vary as individuals in our tolerances for affection. So by that, I don't just mean that some of us are more affectionate than others or are more demonstrative of our love than others, but some of us are more comfortable with that. For some of us, saying I love you or hugging somebody or putting our arm around somebody, no big deal. We do that all the time. We're very comfortable with it. For the next person, those things might be very uncomfortable. They might be monumental. And so they have to find other ways. They tend to find other ways of displaying affection. For many people, it's things that I do for other people, ways that I help them. And that's how I show my love for them, versus coming out and saying it or kissing them or holding their hand. So, just as our personalities vary, our ways of showing love and affection vary, and that's okay. They should.
Mm-hmm. So say, for example, in your experience when it comes to your love language being affection, how would you handle if someone's love language is like not physical affection? Is there other, is it proper, is it a best way to find another person's communication and love language in order to sort of still you doing your part in showing them, but also sort of respecting the boundary that they've set in place?
Sure. So you're making reference to love languages, the idea that we each have a particular style or set of practices that we value as a way of giving and receiving love. So for some people, it might be tokens, like I love it when people buy me gifts or give me things that signify their love. For other people, it may be ways of communicating. So I need to hear, I love you. I need to have somebody hug me. I need to have somebody hold my hand. For some people, it may be doing favors for them, helping them out. There's lots of different ways to do that. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that when people come together in relationship, think about a romantic relationship, for example, they may bring very different styles. One person might be much more overt, and the other person's way of showing that they love you might be to do things for you. They're not so comfortable being expressive. And that creates a bit of a conundrum in relationships. This is not uncommon at all, by the way. It's quite typical that two people will come together and have very different styles or levels of comfort with showing affection. The question is, what do we do with that in our relationship? And I think that there are really two things that are essential for both people in a relationship like that to pay attention to. One is valuing and honoring who they are as individuals, valuing and honoring what their own style or love language is. Mine might be to be very expressive and overt. My partner's might be to, they do things for me. They look after things that need doing, and that's how they show their love for me. I don't need to abandon my love language just to make this relationship work, just to adapt to my partner. It's important that I honor who I am. And over time, we know this to be true both from research and just from our own experiences in relationships. Over time, if I am modeling a behavior that is of value to me, if it's important to me that my romantic partner become more demonstrative, then I can model that behavior. I can allow my partner to see me being expressive of my affection with other important people in my life, other family members, my close friends, and to see that as something that we value. Over time, generally, my partner will begin to adapt to that behavior and become more comfortable and more demonstrative themselves. So that's number one. The number two thing that's important to make the relationship work with respect to that difference is to honor what the partner does rather than devalue it. And this is the more typical problem, the more typical mistake that I see people make in relationships is they will take the approach of, you're not doing it right because you're not doing it the way I want. So my parents, once again, to use them as an example, had a relationship like that where their love languages were very different. And I heard a certain amount of grumbling about that from each partner, that they wanted the other to be more like them. And that's okay to want that. It is not okay to devalue what the other person is doing when it is coming from a place of genuineness from them. This is the way that they are genuinely, honestly showing you that they love you. The last thing you want to do is devalue that or put that down and say, well, you're not doing it right because you're not doing it the way I want or the way I expect or the way I do it. Rather, what you want to do to make the relationship work is recognize those behaviors for what they are. You're not just washing my car. You're not just doing my laundry. You're not just making sure I have a lunch packed for work tomorrow. You are also expressing your love for me. Those are acts of love when they come from that genuine place in someone else. And so far from devaluing them, I want to value them. I want to recognize them. I want to acknowledge and express my gratitude for those things, because that implies to the other person that I see you, I hear you, I recognize that what you are doing comes from a place of love. And I want you to know that I appreciate that, even if you do it differently than I do. And so when both people can accomplish both of those tasks, honoring themselves, and then also, and the more difficult task often is honoring the other person instead of expecting them or requiring them to be like you. If they can do that, what's going to happen in most relationships is that over time, the partners will grow to converge with each other. So I will grow to be more like my partner, and my partner will grow to be more like me. And so we will meet in the middle, which is, that's where a relationship resides anyway. We are adapting to each other. That's what it means to be in relationship to someone else.
Yeah, no, that's very true. And I think we all forget that as well. I think the whole idea of devaluing someone else is a very true statement, 'cause it's a very true experience. And I think a lot of us have sort of felt that. Either we've felt that onto us or we've done that to someone else, even sometimes even unknowingly as well. There's situations where I think a partner's love language can be showing affection through sending a message of motivation or saying you're doing such a great job, whereas the other one says it as, oh, why are you sending me a message like that? I'm trying to be my own person, and have that sort of miscommunication within there as well. And when it comes to families, I think everyone's love language is very different within a family as well, which also adds a whole other, I think, podcast episode in dealing with the love language within a family. And it's definitely something that I think we should definitely have on the show again. So we would love to have you on again and hopefully discuss that area of communication as well. Before we come towards the end of the show, I love to go on to the open mic. And this gives you a chance to talk about something that maybe we didn't get to discuss throughout the show, or maybe talk about some areas that are a little bit related to what we're talking about today. So in the last minute, I'd love to give you the floor and just share what's on your mind with us today.
I'd like to come back to the observation we made at the start of the podcast, which is that humans are innately social beings. We don't just enjoy having relationships in our lives, we need them. We don't all need the same number or the same level or the same quality or characteristics of relationships, but we all need to be in relationship to other people. That's not an option for us. And that's just how we've evolved as human beings. I think that it's easy sometimes for us as individuals to devalue that need in ourselves, to neglect it, neglect our relationships. And just like if we neglect our necessity to eat or we neglect our requirement to sleep, nature has built-in reminders. We get hungry, we get sleepy. That reminds us, oh yeah, I got to attend to that need. Nature has a built-in reminder that we're not attending to our need to relate to other people. And that built-in reminder is the experience that we call loneliness. It's easy to overlook that. It's easy to think it's not that important, but it is. And so that's a signal, if we feel lonely, that we really need to make sure we're not ignoring. We need to attend to that if we feel it.
Mm-hmm. And your book as well, I think it is called the Loneliness Cure as well. If it's sort of tied into that idea of how to sort of come back out from the loneliness idea. Now, if anyone wants to find out a little bit more about that book or even find that book, is it available on any platform?
Of course. It's available on Amazon, on Barnes & Noble. You can read more about it at my own website, which is koryfloyd.com. And any of those platforms could give you more information about it and a link to order.
Oh, perfect. And if anyone wants to find out a little bit more about some of the other work that you're also talking about, I think we spoke about 16 different publications that you also have, which is well-versed in communication in different areas. Are there places that anyone can go to find any of those other publications available?
Once again, koryfloyd.com.
Okay, perfect.
So it's 16 different books and several dozen research articles and other kinds of papers. All of it is there.
Okay.
So you can find out about my research on loneliness, my research on affection, my research on families, and lots of other topics that have sort of consumed my attention over the last 30 years.
That's perfect. And it's going to be well-versed as well, so I can't wait to hear more about it. Thank you so much, Kory, for coming onto the show today and talking so much about communication and the way that different family functions are set in place and how to sort of combat and hopefully create a cohesive family. And I hope we answered a lot of the audience's questions when it comes to creating that cohesion and allowing each family member to be accepted and to be at least have some sort of say. So thank you again, Kory, for joining me on the show today.
It's been a delight. Thanks.
And I hope you guys learned as much as I did when it comes to the way that family functions. I'll see you all in the next episode.
You've been listening to Altogether, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent. Thanks for tuning in.